The San Juan Mountains of Colorado are unforgiving of error. Near the end of 1889, the landscape was dominated by a profound and brutal quiet, and a cold so intense it could fracture lodgepole pines like brittle twigs. At an elevation of 10,000 feet, the buffer for mistakes was not a matter of degrees, but of mere minutes of survival. The majority of men who erected cabins in these highlands built them squat, dim, and solid, clinging to the ground in a frantic effort to trap any available warmth. They constructed wooden containers designed to consume wooden fuel. Yet, if you had traveled by Silas Vane's claim that December, you would have witnessed something that appeared to be pure folly. Connected to the southern face of his conventional log cabin was a peculiar structure that challenged all norms of frontier design. It was a 20-foot-high vertical column, ascending like a spire above his roof, fashioned from dark, rough stone and sheathed in panels of industrial plate glass. Against the snow, it shimmered, looking both alien and delicate. The local inhabitants found it not just peculiar, but deeply insulting. For the seasoned miners and trappers of the San Juans, glass was an indulgence, a vulnerability, a substance that invited the cold inside. When they gazed at Vane's creation, they saw a hothouse for phantoms, a delicate vanity that would either be smashed by the first serious blizzard, or, even worse, cause his family to freeze to death by transforming their dwelling into an icebox. They labeled it a miscalculation. They named it Vane's Folly. However, Silas Vane was not a homesteader making guesses about staying alive. He was a mining engineer who approached heat not as an issue of fuel, but as one of fluid dynamics. Where his neighbors perceived a window, Vane perceived an engine. He grasped that the sun striking that dark stone was more than just light. It was potential energy waiting to be harnessed. And as the rest of the valley burned through fortunes in timber to combat the sub-zero nights, Silas Vane was on the verge of proving a physical principle that would maintain his cabin at a consistently comfortable temperature during the day, without lighting a single match. The tragedy was that they ridiculed him right up to the very moment the thermometer confirmed he was right. To grasp why Vane's glass tower was so groundbreaking, one must first comprehend the crushing economics of staying warm in 1889. At that time, the San Juan Mountains were not some untouched, timber-abundant wilderness. The area was still recuperating from the devastating fires of the 1870s. The forest that had grown back was young, consisting mostly of 20-year-old aspen groves that burned quickly and produced little sustained heat. Dense firewood with high BTU content was not readily available. It was scarce, located far away, and was incredibly heavy. For a homesteader of that period, the cost of heat was measured in physical depletion. You didn't settle a utility bill. You paid with your own calories and hours of labor. The prevailing heating technology of the era was the cast iron stove. While we may romanticize these devices now, in the high Rockies, they were inefficient despots. A cast iron stove acts as a radiant point source. It establishes a zone of blistering, almost intolerable heat within a 5-foot circle, while the corners of the same room stay below freezing. It demands constant attention. A man could dedicate 3 weeks of his summer solely to felling, cutting, splitting, and stacking the cordwood needed to get through a 6-month winter. That represents weeks of work diverted from mining, hunting, or improving his property, just to be incinerated in a black iron box. The cabins themselves were constantly losing that painstakingly acquired heat. The typical single-wall log construction is, from a thermodynamic standpoint, a catastrophe. Logs possess a decent R value per inch, but the seams, the chinking between the timbers, are well-known points of failure. In 1889, builders used a mix of mud, moss, or lime mortar to fill these gaps. But as the logs cured, they would shrink and warp. The chinking would crack. The outcome was a structure that was never truly sealed. Cold air would seep in at floor level, and the warm air, the very air you just spent hours chopping wood to create, would escape through the roof. This process is known as thermal bleed. It's akin to trying to heat a colander. Silas Vane assessed this equation, the labor investment for wood, the stove's inefficiency, and the cabin's thermal leakage, and concluded that the numbers were unsustainable. But Vane possessed an advantage. He wasn't a woodworker. He was a ventilation engineer for the local silver mines. Deep underground, You don't use fans to circulate air through miles of tunnels. You use the laws of physics. You employ temperature differentials. Vane understood that if you have two vertical shafts and you heat the air in one, that air becomes less dense. It rises. This motion generates a vacuum that draws fresh, cooler air down the second shaft. It functions as a passive engine powered entirely by density. He had dedicated years to managing airflow deep within the Earth, using only the principles of convection. When he examined his cabin, he didn't perceive a static container. He saw a ventilation apparatus. His neighbors were fixated on the chemical process of combustion, burning more material to generate more heat. Vane was fixated on the physical process of convection, moving the heat that was already present. The scarcity of wood after the 1870s fires was not a crisis for him. It was a parameter for his design. It compelled him to consider the only other energy source available in the high-altitude winter: the sun. As the rest of the community sharpened their axes for another winter of servitude to their stoves, Vane was calculating the volume of air he could move with a 20-foot column of glass. He wasn't aiming to improve the log cabin. He was aiming to convert his entire house into a solar-powered pump. To build this solar pump, Vane required a material that was practically unheard of in the high country: large-format industrial glass. One must appreciate the rarity of this material to comprehend the sheer audacity of his plan. In the 1880s, the typical window on the American frontier was small, valuable, and partitioned. Builders employed 12/12 double-hung sashes, grids of small glass panes held by wooden dividers, because producing large, unblemished sheets was an immensely expensive industrial process. Glass was considered a thermal liability in a building's shell. It was the place where heat went to die. To construct an entire wall from it was, in the local mindset, the architectural equivalent of charging into battle without armor. However, the world of manufacturing was changing. The Glasgow Plate Glass Company had patented machinery for rolling large sheets only 3 years before, and experimental batches were starting to show up in industrial supply chains. Vane didn't purchase standard window panes. He acquired a crate of experimental industrial surplus, thick, rolled plate glass designed for factory skylights back east. It was heavy, had minor distortions, and was shockingly expensive. When that crate was delivered to the rail station in the valley below, it was worth more money than most local miners made in a year. The construction period was a spectacle of high tension. Vane was forced to transport these enormous, delicate sheets up steep mountain switchbacks in a wagon with rudimentary suspension. Every dip in the path, every rock beneath a wheel, posed a threat to destroy the project before it even started. The neighbors offered no encouragement. They observed from their porches, mentally noting each jolt in the road, listening for the sound of shattering glass. To them, this was the pinnacle of arrogance. A man hauling a fragile, transparent wall up a mountain known for rock slides and avalanches. It solidified their opinion of Vane. He was a city engineer dabbling in survival, bringing delicate playthings into a landscape that could crush solid iron. Once the glass made it up the mountain, its positioning was absolute. Vane oriented the entire structure to face due south. This was not a casual choice. It was a precise calculation based on solar declination. During the winter, the sun travels in a low arc across the southern horizon. Vane needed a surface that was perpendicular to those low-angled rays to minimize reflection and maximize the energy that passed through. Had he angled it southeast for the morning light, or southwest for the evening, he would have missed the peak intensity of the midday exposure. He was constructing a trap for photons, and the geometry had to be perfect. The structural hazards were enormous. The San Juan Mountains create their own weather patterns. Wind can gust up to 80 miles per hour, carrying ice particles that can scour wood like sandpaper. Hailstones the size of a man's fist are not unheard of in the transitional seasons. Vane was, in effect, mounting a giant, brittle sail onto the side of his house. He had to factor in wind loads that would cause the glass to flex, and thermal stress that would make the panes expand rapidly when the sun hit them in 20 below zero temperatures. If the glass were to break, the system wouldn't simply cease to function. It would expose the entire cabin interior to the storm, almost certainly resulting in the death of anyone inside. But Vane's calculations extended beyond structural engineering. They were a form of financial projection. He analyzed the problem from the perspective of capital investment versus operational cost. His neighbors opted for the low initial expense of a cheap stove, thereby accepting the high operational cost of endless labor to keep it fed. They were paying for their heat on a daily basis, with their own bodies. Vane chose the reverse. He took on a huge upfront capital outlay, the cost of the glass and stone, in order to completely eliminate the operational cost. He was, in essence, prepaying for 2 decades of warmth. It was a wager that demanded both ready cash and unshakable confidence. But Vane understood that once the final screw was in place, the sun would never send him an invoice. To the casual glance of a passing trapper, the structure resembled a chimney that had been erected on the wrong side of the house. It was a vertical column, 4 feet across and 20 feet high, fastened to the exterior southern face of the cabin. But whereas a chimney is engineered to vent waste, this apparatus was engineered to absorb energy. It was not a window. A window is an opening in a wall for providing a view. This was a sealed thermodynamic device built for a specific function. Vane had assembled what contemporary engineers would term a thermosiphon air panel, but in 1889 it was just a heater. To see how it conquered the winter, we must break it down component by component, as every part of its assembly was an application of specific material physics. The first element was the absorber plate. Vane did not use the smooth, finished logs of the cabin wall as the backing for his glass. Wood is an insulator. It impedes the transfer of heat. Instead, he constructed a secondary wall against the cabin's exterior using local black basalt. He didn't select this stone for its appearance. He chose it for its optical characteristics. Basalt is a dense volcanic rock and is naturally dark. But Vane took it a step further. He didn't shape the stones into flat surfaces. He dry stacked them into a rough, uneven formation. A smooth wall reflects a portion of sunlight away, sending that energy back into the sky. A rough, irregular surface creates countless tiny pockets and shadows. It captures the light, causing the photons to ricochet between the stone faces until their energy is completely absorbed. This jagged wall was a sponge for solar radiation, designed to become as hot as possible, as fast as possible. Set 4 inches in front of this stone face was the glazing assembly. This was the most technologically advanced part of the construction. Vane understood that a single pane of glass would be ineffective. Single pane glass has an R value of about 1. It conducts cold nearly as well as it transmits light. If he had used just 1 layer, the heat gained from the stone would have simply radiated back into the frozen yard the moment a cloud obscured the sun. So, Vane improvised a primitive version of what we now call an insulated glazing unit, or IGU. He took 2 sheets of that valuable industrial plate glass and held them apart with a 1/2-inch strip of oiled hardwood. He sealed the perimeter with a compound of pine tar and oakum, creating a trapped layer of dead air between the panes. Air, when it is still, is an exceptional insulator. By trapping that 1/2 inch of air, he effectively doubled the R value of the wall. He had fashioned a one-way energy valve. Shortwave solar radiation could travel through the glass to strike the stone, but the heat produced by the stone, long-wave infrared radiation, was trapped behind the double barrier. It was the greenhouse effect, weaponized and contained within a 4-inch space. That 4-inch space between the basalt absorber and the glass glazing was the engine's combustion chamber, though no fire ever burned there. This was the air channel. It was completely sealed from the outside environment, but it was open to the cabin's interior. This is where the system's plumbing became apparent. At the very base of the tower, cut through the log wall of the cabin near the floor, was the intake vent. It was a rectangular hole equipped with a sliding damper. Its purpose was to collect the coldest air in the room, the dense, still layer of air that gathers around one's feet in a poorly heated home. 20 feet directly above, near the peak of the cathedral ceiling, was the exhaust vent. This served as the delivery point. By linking the inside of the house to the exterior glass column at both its top and bottom, Vane had completed the circuit. He wasn't depending on a fan to move the air. He was depending on the air to move itself. But for this to function, the construction had to be completely sealed. If wind could get through the joints, it would ruin the pressure differential. Vane caulked every seam with meticulous attention, using strips of wool and additional pine tar. The system had to be a closed loop. Cabin air enters at the bottom, rises along the heated stone face, and re-enters the cabin at the top. It was a fluid dynamic circuit, silent and unseen, waiting for the sun to activate it. When the sun finally cleared the eastern ridges of the San Juans at 8 a.m., the outside temperature was 15 degrees below zero. In any other cabin, this was the moment of greatest hardship, when the stove had burned down to embers and the chill had penetrated the bedding. But at the Vane homestead, this was the moment the engine started. The ignition process was completely silent. It began the instant the first photons of sunlight hit the south face of the tower. Here, the specific qualities of the materials determine the result. Sunlight travels through the void of space as short-wave radiation. Glass, due to its chemical makeup, is transparent to these short wavelengths. The energy passed through the double-paned glazing as if it wasn't even there, striking the rough, black basalt wall behind it. Upon impact, a physical change took place. The basalt absorbed the light energy and transformed it into thermal energy, heat. The stone started to radiate this heat back out, but it did so as long-wave infrared radiation. And this is the trap. Glass is transparent to light, but it is mostly opaque to infrared heat. The energy could enter, but it could not leave. The 4-inch air gap between the stone and the glass turned into a thermal prison. Within 20 minutes of sunrise, the surface of the black stone could reach temperatures over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, even as the air on the other side of the glass was cold enough to kill a person. This intense, focused heat transfer triggered the engine's second phase, the density shift. Air is a fluid, and like all fluids, its density is governed by its temperature. As the air molecules within that narrow, 4-inch gap made contact with the scorching hot stone, they became agitated. They began to vibrate with great force, pushing against each other, requiring more room. As they spread out, the air mass became substantially less dense than the air inside the cabin. It grew lighter. And because nature cannot tolerate a density imbalance, that light, expanded air had no option but to move. It started to rise. This is the convection loop. It is not a gentle waft. In a system designed by Vane, it is a powerful current. As the superheated air surged up the 20-foot shaft toward the ceiling vent, it created a void behind it. It produced a vacuum at the base of the tower. This vacuum exerted a physical pull on the cabin's interior. It reached through the lower intake vent and seized the coldest, heaviest air settled on the floorboards, the same air that chills your toes in a typical log home. It drew that cold air into the bottom of the solar shaft to take the place of the rising hot air. The moment that cold air met the hot stone, it too heated up, expanded, and raced upward. The force of this loop was governed by the stack effect. In fluid dynamics, the height of a chimney acts as a multiplier of force. If Vane had built a standard window, the pressure difference would have been insignificant. A 3-foot vertical rise generates a lazy, drifting flow. But a 20-foot vertical rise creates a draft with real velocity. The taller the column, the greater the pressure difference between the intake and the exhaust, and the faster the air circulates. Vane had constructed a thermal accelerator. By the time the air exited the top vent into the cabin, it wasn't merely warm. It was moving with enough force to make the curtains flutter, carrying the heat to the most distant corners of the room. This was a radical departure from the wood stove. A stove operates on radiation. It projects heat in straight lines, like light from a lamp. If you are in its direct path, you feel intense heat. If you are in its shadow, you feel cold. It establishes a static, layered heat profile where the ceiling is hot and the floor is frozen. Vane's tower operated on convection. It physically blended the air in the room. It took the cold air from the floor, processed it through the solar engine, and returned it as hot air at the ceiling, which then cooled slightly and settled back to the floor to be recycled. It was a conveyor belt of warmth that systematically removed the cold from the house. This is why the neighbors were so perplexed. They would ride past and see the glass gleaming in the sun, but they would see no smoke. In their experience, heat was a result of destruction. You had to destroy wood to create warmth. You saw the smoke. You smelled the soot. To witness a house that was warm without a plume from its chimney was a cognitive contradiction they could not accept. They concluded Vane must be freezing inside, bundled in a coat, pretending his glass folly was a success. They failed to grasp that he wasn't consuming fuel. He was simply riding a current of thermodynamics that had always been there, invisible and unused, waiting for someone to construct a sail large enough to harness it. But to comprehend the neighbor's skepticism, one must also consider the time. In the deep winter of the San Juan Mountains, the sun is a brief guest. It appears late and departs early. By 4:30 p.m., the direct sunlight is gone, having slipped behind the western peaks. The moment the sun disappears, the ambient temperature begins a steep decline. In 1889, this was the frightening reality of the high country. The coldest part of the night is not midnight. It is the hour before dawn, around 4 a.m., often 12 hours after the last rays of sun have vanished. This was the weakness the critics identified. They contended that Vane's glass engine was only useful in good weather. They asserted that as soon as the sun set, the convection loop would cease, the air in the glass shaft would freeze, and the house would become a tomb. If the system had relied solely on the immediate heating of air, they would have been correct. Air possesses almost no thermal mass. It retains heat poorly and loses it almost instantly. But Silas Vane was not depending on the air to hold the energy. He was depending on the stone. This leads us to the second, and perhaps more vital principle of the design: thermal mass. To the neighbors, the black basalt wall behind the glass was merely a support structure for the tower. To Vane, it was a battery. Every material in existence has a property known as specific heat capacity, the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of that material by 1 degree. Wood, which everyone else used for building, has relatively low thermal conductivity, but a respectable specific heat. However, being porous and filled with air, it functions mainly as an insulator. It resists the flow of heat. When you heat a log wall, the surface becomes hot, but the heat seldom penetrates deep into the timber. Once the fire is out, the wood cools quickly because it hasn't stored a significant charge of energy. Basalt is different. It is dense, heavy, and conductive. When solar radiation battered that black stone wall for 8 hours during the day, the heat did not just remain on the surface, it conducted inward. It traveled through the solid rock, inch by inch, soaking into the core of the wall. Vane had, in effect, built a massive vertical flywheel for storing energy. While the air circulating in the gap delivered immediate warmth during the day, the stone was quietly accumulating a surplus of British thermal units for the long night to come. This phenomenon is known as the time lag, or phase shift. It is the delay between the moment heat strikes the outside of a wall and the moment it reaches the inside. Vane calculated the thickness of his basalt wall with obsessive care. If the wall were too thin, for instance 6 inches, the heat would pass through it too rapidly, making the cabin excessively hot by noon and leaving the stone cold by midnight. If the wall were too thick, say 3 feet, the heat would never fully make it to the other side, and the energy would be lost. Vane dimensioned his mass to produce a 12-hour phase shift. Imagine the heat as a slow-moving wave traveling through the solid rock. The intense solar energy absorbed at high noon started its journey through the stone at that point. But due to the density of the basalt, that wave of warmth moved slowly. It did not arrive at the interior surface of the wall until the middle of the night. So, picture the scene at 10 p.m. Outside, the wind is howling, and the temperature has fallen to 10 below zero. The neighbors are desperately feeding their stoves because their fires are dwindling and their cabins are cooling down instantly. But at the Vane homestead, something extraordinary is occurring. The sun has been gone for 6 hours, yet the basalt wall behind the glass is still emitting heat. It is releasing the energy it absorbed at 10 a.m. The stone surface facing the air gap stays warm, keeping the air inside the siphon buoyant. The convection loop certainly slows. It doesn't roar with the velocity it had at midday, but it does not cease. The battery is discharging. The stone continues to heat the air in the gap, and that warm air continues to rise, drifting out of the top vent and circulating through the silent cabin. The system transforms the high-intensity, short-duration burst of sunlight into a low-intensity, long-duration release of warmth. This is the fundamental distinction between an active fuel source and a passive thermal battery. A wood stove is binary. It is either burning and hot or extinguished and cold. It needs constant human intervention to bridge the time between adding more fuel. Vane's thermal mass smoothed out this curve. It took the sharp spike of solar energy and flattened it into a steady, livable baseline. He wasn't battling the night. He was simply saving the day's energy to use it later. The critics saw a pile of rocks. Vane saw a time machine for heat, carrying the warmth of noon into the frozen darkness of 4 a.m. The theoretical debates came to an end on January 14, 1889. That was the day the barometer in the Silverton mining office fell to a point that the clerk initially dismissed as a mechanical failure. The region was caught in a volatile weather pattern. A wet El Niño cycle had blanketed the slopes with snow, which then abruptly yielded to a dry, harsh La Niña freeze. A low-pressure system of historic proportions was about to collide with an Arctic front sweeping down from the Canadian Shield. The sky took on the color of a dark bruise, and the wind didn't just increase. It arrived like a solid force, gusting to 60 miles per hour. By late afternoon, the temperature had plunged to 20 degrees below zero. This was no ordinary winter storm. It was a trial for every living creature and every man-made structure in the San Juan Mountains. For the neighbors residing in conventional log cabins, the storm was an immediate life-or-death emergency. The physics of a log cabin alter dramatically in high winds. It is no longer just a question of insulation. It becomes a fight against infiltration. The 60-mile-per-hour wind pressurized the exteriors of the houses, driving freezing air through minuscule cracks in the chinking and gaps around door frames. This is called forced convection. The wind stripped away the protective layer of heat from the outer logs, chilling the wood to its core, while at the same time blasting drafts of sub-zero air across the interior floors. Families awoke the following morning to a chilling discovery. The water in the pails inside their homes had frozen solid. This occurred even with their cast iron stoves glowing cherry red. The radiant heat from the stoves was being defeated by the convective cooling of the wind. To maintain an interior temperature above freezing, fuel consumption had to be doubled. Men who had carefully managed their wood piles found themselves feeding log after log into the firebox, only to feel the warmth disappear just inches from the stove. This led to a secondary emergency, a crisis of fuel supply. A wood stove running at full capacity consumes a standard split log every 45 minutes. With the storm lasting for 3 days, the indoor wood supplies were exhausted within the first 24 hours. This compelled the men to venture outside into the blizzard to split more wood. They had to abandon the marginal safety of the cabin, struggle through waist-deep snow, and swing axes with numb hands and blinding wind, all to feed the iron beast that was barely keeping their families alive. It was a vicious cycle of fatigue and caloric drain. The colder it became, the harder they had to work, and the more energy they expended, both in the stove and from their own bodies. Inside the cabin of Silas Vane, the situation was entirely different. The first thing a visitor would have noticed was the sound, or more accurately, the absence of it. In a typical cabin, the wind screams through the eaves and shakes the windows. In Vane's home, the heavy stone mass and the sealed glass column served as a sound dampener. The storm was a visual spectacle, not an auditory one. But the thermal performance was the true marvel. Critics had presumed that without direct, bright sunshine, the glass tower would be useless. They failed to grasp the subtleties of solar radiation. Even during a blizzard, unless the cloud cover is exceptionally thick, UV and visible light still make it through the atmosphere. This is known as diffuse radiation. While it doesn't have the intensity of direct sunlight, it still carries energy. The glass tower captured this diffuse light. The black basalt did not reach the scorching temperatures of a clear day, but it stayed significantly warmer than the frozen air outside. The siphon didn't roar with a high-speed draft. It hummed. It continued to circulate a gentle flow of tempered air, keeping the cabin's atmosphere in motion and preventing the stratification that froze water pails in other homes. Moreover, the cabin's design used the earth itself as a buffer. Vane had constructed the stone wall not only as a solar collector on the south side, but also as a structural anchor. The north side of the house, which faced the full force of the Arctic wind, was heavily banked with earth and stone. While his neighbors' cabins were exposed boxes losing heat on all four sides, Vane's home presented a low, streamlined profile to the storm. The wind tended to flow over it rather than battering it. The thermal mass of the stone, charged with weeks of accumulated solar energy, resisted rapid temperature changes. It possessed thermal inertia. It behaved like a heavy flywheel that continues to spin long after the power has been shut off. At the peak of the blizzard, while the valley was immobilized by the cold, Silas Vane sat at his dining table in his shirt sleeves. He was not huddled by a fire. In fact, his stove was cold. He was holding a thermometer near the tower's upper exhaust vent. The mercury registered 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the world was freezing at 20 below. Inside, it felt like a late spring day. He watched the snow whip past the huge glass panes, piling up against the frame's edges, but the glass itself stayed clear, kept warm by the cushion of air moving behind it. He was witnessing the confirmation of his calculations. He had substituted the brute force of combustion with the elegance of insulation and aerodynamics. The storm was raging, but his engine was running. When the wind finally subsided on the morning of the fourth day, the quiet that settled over the San Juan Mountains was profound. It was the silence of deep snow and utter fatigue. Across the valley, cabin doors creaked open, and men emerged like soldiers from a bombardment, squinting in the blinding white light. They were exhausted. They had endured 72 hours under siege, feeding fires that failed to warm them, sleeping in turns, and fighting the encroaching frost that threatened their homes. They looked toward the Vane homestead, fully anticipating a tragedy. The general belief was that the glass tower would be shattered, its fragments buried beneath the snowdrifts. Or, if the glass had somehow survived, the structure would be dark and still, the family inside frozen by the enormous thermal liability Vane had foolishly bolted to his wall. They expected to discover a monument to his arrogance. Instead, they saw the glass column standing immaculate and defiant, shedding the snow that attempted to adhere to its vertical surface. And even more unsettling, there was no smoke rising from the main chimney. A small party of neighbors, led by the same men who had been the most outspoken in their ridicule, trudged through the waist-deep snow to check on the family. They were motivated by a mixture of genuine concern and morbid curiosity. When they arrived at the door, they heard no signs of distress. They knocked, preparing themselves for the worst. Silas Vane answered the door, and the entire narrative of the winter collapsed in a single moment. He was not wearing a coat. He was not shivering. And as the door opened, a wave of air washed over the men. It was not the smoky, harsh heat of a wood stove that scorches your front while your back remains cold. It was clean, dry, and buoyant warmth. It felt like stepping into a bakery on a summer day. The neighbors stood on the doorstep, speechless, their breath turning to vapor in the cold air, gazing at a man who seemed to have weathered the blizzard on another world entirely. Vane did not gloat. He simply moved aside and welcomed the doubters to examine his device. He guided them to the upper vent of the solar siphon, positioned high on the south wall. He instructed them to remove their gloves and hold their hands up to the opening. One by one, they felt it. A steady, silent current of air, heated to nearly 90 degrees Fahrenheit, flowing out of the wall. There was no fan. There was no fire. It was simply the physics of the stack effect, tirelessly pumping warmth into the room as long as the sun was visible. Next came the evidence from the thermometer. Vane had maintained a detailed logbook throughout the storm. While his neighbors' cabins had experienced wild temperature swings between freezing and 50 degrees based on the state of their fires, Vane's interior temperature had maintained a stable equilibrium. During daylight hours, even with the outside air at 20 below, the cabin stayed around 68 degrees. At night, as the thermal battery of the basalt wall discharged its stored energy, the temperature slowly decreased to 62. It never fell below 60. But the most conclusive piece of evidence was the woodpile. Vane led the men out back to his woodshed. It was almost completely full. While every other family in the valley had burned through a quarter of their winter supply in just 3 days, Vane's stack was virtually untouched. He explained the efficiency in simple, stark terms. He used wood only in the cook stove to boil coffee and cook bacon. The heating load, the energy needed to keep the structure livable, had been entirely delegated to the sun. He had cut his fuel consumption by 80% compared to the previous winter. The psychological atmosphere in the room changed completely. For months, the community had seen the glass tower as a costly blunder, a sign that Vane's wealth exceeded his common sense. Now, standing in his warm living room, mentally calculating their own aching backs and shrinking wood piles, the equation was inverted. The glass was not an expense, it was an investment. Vane had exchanged the recurring, physically demanding labor of chopping wood for a one-time capital cost. They understood that while they were indentured to their stoves, bound to the cycle of cutting, hauling, and burning, Vane had bought his own freedom. The glass had paid for itself in saved labor and calories in a single season. The hothouse for phantoms was suddenly reevaluated. It was no longer a folly. It was the only sensible structure in the entire valley. The neighbors departed from the cabin quietly, the warmth of the solar siphon still on their skin, carrying the heavy knowledge that for the past decade they had been working harder, not smarter. The thermometer's judgment was final. The engineer had been right. The transformation of the San Juan Valley didn't unfold over years, it happened in a matter of weeks. The instant the snow melted enough for wagons to pass, the skepticism that had enveloped the Vane homestead vanished, replaced by a frenzied and practical wave of imitation. The first to convert was Emmett Stoddard, a local carpenter who had been the most vocal in calling the glass tower a hothouse for phantoms. Stoddard was a man of wood and nails, a traditionalist who trusted in thick walls and heavy stoves. But he was also a man who had just spent a week shivering in his own home. He didn't offer Vane an apology. He simply appeared with a notepad and a measuring tape. Stoddard began retrofitting existing cabins almost immediately. He lacked the funds for industrial plate glass or the time to quarry basalt, so he adapted the underlying physics to the materials available. This marked the creation of the poor man's siphon. Instead of a 20-foot stone tower, Stoddard and the miners he assisted built shorter, wider collectors. They stripped the southern walls of their cabins down to the framing. For the absorber plate, they didn't use stone. They took discarded kerosene cans and corrugated roofing metal, hammered them flat, and coated them with a mix of soot and linseed oil to create a non-reflective black surface. Metal has less thermal mass than stone. It doesn't retain heat for the night as effectively, but it transfers heat into the air gap much more quickly. It was a daytime drive system, designed to blast heat into the cabin while the sun was out, allowing the stove to be kept at a low burn. The glazing for these retrofits was a hodgepodge of scavenged parts. Miners combed abandoned camps for old window sashes, turning them horizontally and sealing the gaps with clay and straw. They weren't perfectly sealed, and they weren't attractive, but they functioned. The principle of convection is forgiving. It doesn't need perfection to work. It just needs a temperature difference. Even these rough, leaky siphons increased interior temperatures by 15 degrees during the day. By the spring of 1890, the architecture of the mining camps had changed. The uniform brown of log cabins was now broken up by glints of glass and black metal on the southern faces of the buildings. It became a mark of status, not of wealth, but of cleverness. If you lacked a siphon, you were burning twice as much wood as your neighbor, and in an economy based on labor, that made you the fool. This knowledge did not remain confined to the valley. The San Juans were a busy route for prospectors, surveyors, and engineers. Men who warmed themselves at Vane's vents took the idea to Silverton, Ouray, and Telluride. It wasn't disseminated through textbooks or academic lectures. It spread because of the simple, undeniable comfort it provided. However, as the method propagated, it also confirmed a much older form of wisdom that the settlers had mostly overlooked. Vane often redirected the praise he received by gesturing toward the cliffs. The ancestral Puebloans, the Anasazi, had constructed their settlements in these same canyons 1,000 years prior. They lacked glass, but they oriented their entire communities to the south, using the thermal mass of cliff overhangs to capture the low winter sun and provide shade from the high summer sun. Vane hadn't invented a new law of physics. He had simply recalled an ancient one and added a layer of glass to amplify it. Naturally, not every attempt was a success. The spread of the idea also demonstrated the unforgiving nature of the physics involved. Some builders, failing to grasp the mechanism, constructed their siphons on east-facing walls, receiving only a few hours of weak morning light before the system shut down. Others neglected to properly seal the air gap, letting the wind strip away the heat before it could rise. The most spectacular failures came from those who forgot the vents. They built sealed glass boxes against their walls without intake and exhaust ports, turning their cabins into ovens that became unbearable by noon but offered no air circulation. These mistakes were educational. They taught the community that this was not magic. It was engineering. It demanded correct orientation, sealing, and airflow. You couldn't just affix glass to a wall and expect results. You had to build the engine properly. But for those who did, the glass tower became the difference between merely enduring the winter and mastering it. The tragedy of this technology is not that it became obsolete, but that it was eclipsed by a force more convenient than physics: fossil fuels. As the 20th century began, the railroads pushed through the high mountain passes, bringing with them seemingly endless tons of cheap coal. Following that came heating oil, and eventually, the electrical grid. Suddenly, the immense economic pressure to conserve heat disappeared. You no longer needed to understand solar angles or thermal mass. You just had to shovel coal or adjust a thermostat. The free heat from the sun was supplanted by the cheap heat from the ground. We stopped constructing engines and started constructing containers. The philosophy of architecture shifted from cooperating with the environment to overpowering it. We began to build homes that looked identical in Arizona and in Maine, completely disregarding the sun. We replaced the heavy, heat-storing stone of Vane's cabin with light wood framing and fiberglass insulation. We grew obsessed with R value, the resistance to heat transfer, while completely forgetting about thermal mass, the storage of heat. We built lightweight, insulated coolers that had no capacity to bank energy. This change created a reliance on mechanical systems. Today, we build homes that are essentially life support pods, unlivable without the continuous input of electricity and gas. We invest tens of thousands of dollars in complex HVAC systems, furnaces, blowers, heat pumps, to accomplish exactly what Silas Vane did with a pile of rocks and some glass. We combat the climate instead of harnessing it. When the power fails in a modern home during a blizzard, the temperature plummets instantly because there is no battery, no mass, no passive engine to maintain circulation. The irony is staggering. We see the 19th century as a time of primitive hardship, yet in 1889, a mining engineer in the wilderness possessed a more sophisticated understanding of energy than most contemporary architects. He knew that the house itself should be the heating system. We have exchanged that insight for convenience, and in doing so, we have forgotten that the physics have not changed. The sun still radiates the same energy. The stack effect still creates the same pressure. The only thing that has altered is our inclination to use it. We are paying a monthly fee for warmth that Silas Vane collected for free, simply because we forgot how to build a sail to catch the sun. Silas Vane did not invent the sun, nor did he invent the wind. He simply possessed the insight to construct a sail to harness them. That is the fundamental lesson of the San Juan winter. We often mistake complexity for advancement, believing that a smart home must have sensors and circuits. But Vane demonstrated that the most advanced technology is frequently just a meticulous application of natural principles. He didn't require a better fuel. He required a better design. Consider your own home today. Are you fighting the climate with your finances, paying to heat a leaky box? Or are you collaborating with the physics that surround you? If you're interested in more deep explorations of forgotten engineering that can solve modern challenges, click that subscribe button and like this video. It assists us in unearthing the truth about how we once managed to survive. Until our next discussion, stay practical and stay warm.